Well, my name's Adam White. I'm Executive Director of the C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all tonight for a discussion of the architecture of bureaucracy. Now, if you're a lawyer, a constitutional lawyer in the audience, I want to warn you in advance, we mean the title literally. We're not here to talk about how independent agencies are structured. We're here literally to discuss the architecture of modern and classical government buildings. Now, the Gray Center was founded 3 years ago by the law school's Dean, Henry Butler, and Professor Naomi Rao, who's now in the White House overseeing the regulatory agencies. It was founded to help foster legal scholarship and debate and study over both timeless and new questions over the administrative state. We do a lot of things. We organize conferences, we foster legal scholarship, and now, beginning today, we're starting to do more events here in Washington, D.C., focused on specific issues of modern governance beyond the usual legal scholarship that we tend to promote. For example, for the first half of today, in this room, we had a half-day conference on reforming and modernizing and repairing the Veterans Administration, or the administration of veterans benefits. A range of scholars, practitioners, government officials thinking through how to improve the modern VA and give veterans what they truly deserve rather than the bureaucratic logjam that they've faced for so long. Other recent initiatives at the Gray Center include a recent private conference, soon a public conference, on the non-delegation doctrine, an issue very close to the heart of our namesake, C. Boyden Gray. About 3 weeks ago, we had a symposium hosted by the George Mason Law Review, thinking through agency adjudication and the rule of law, an issue of increasing prominence, including in the Supreme Court. And next week, on the campus of the Scalia Law School in Arlington, Virginia, we're going to have a day-long conference on the future of financial technology, fintech, energy infrastructure, the Food and Drug Administration, and cap and trade. What ties all these things together? Well, these are all aspects of the government's power to grant or deny licenses. Not just the usual rulemaking power, but the government's profound power to grant or deny the approval to undertake innovative activities and economic growth. And so we hope you'll join us next week. You can RSVP online if you're interested. It should be a good event. Now, before I introduce Justin Shubo, who will introduce tonight's speaker, I do want to reflect just briefly on the location of this event, the Decatur House, the home of Stephen Decatur, a war hero of the early Republic, Commodore of the United States Navy. Obviously, any discussion of the history of American architecture in the federal city, on the history of the American Republic, what better place to have this discussion than in the home of Stephen Decatur? But there's another connection between our organization, the Gray Center, and this building that I wanted to highlight for you. In the entryway, you'll find a bust of Gordon Gray. Gordon's the father of our namesake, C. Boyden Gray. He's former Secretary of the Army, former National Security Advisor for President Eisenhower, and a truly dedicated and rightly renowned public servant. So it's a great honor to have this event here in the home of Stephen Decatur, preserved in part by the work of Gordon Gray. And of course, as all things we do in the name of C. Boyden Gray, himself a dedicated public servant and a contributor to both the theories of modern administrative law through his work in the Reagan administration, but also his work as ambassador to the European Union. Now, I'll be the first to admit I know nothing about architecture. That's why I bring in the real experts for these discussions. But one line that's always stuck with me, a line by Winston Churchill, he said, and I'll get it wrong, but I know Justin will get it right, that we shape our buildings, and thereafter, our buildings shape us. I think that's a crucial way to think about this issue of the architecture of modern administration. I'm looking forward to tonight's lecture to learn more about the ideas that informed that shift from classical architecture to the modern architectural style of buildings. And maybe it'll give us some hints as to how those changes changed the way the people inside of those buildings thought about government. But to introduce our speaker, I'll leave that to my friend Justin Shubo, who I'll now introduce. Justin is president of the National Civic Art Society, which is dedicated to promoting beauty and greatness in our nation's civic architecture. You may know Justin and the NCAS through their heroic efforts to improve the design of the Eisenhower Memorial. I'd also say that I encourage you, if you're not already familiar with it, to see the work they've done, their proposals on making Penn Station in New York City great again. But I want to add, speaking of President Trump, I do want to add that President Trump recently nominated Justin to serve on the United States Commission on Fine Arts. I could think of nobody better suited to serve on that commission. I'm so happy to hear of his nomination, not just because I respect Justin's work so much, but also because Justin's a great friend of mine. And so, Justin Shubo, welcome. Y'all take the wine.
Well, thank you, Adam, for that kind introduction. You got the quote from Winston Churchill correct, but the context is interesting. It was in a speech on the need to rebuild the House of Parliament, which had been bombed in the Second World War. And in that speech, he talked about the benefit of the design of the interior of the Parliament, since in Parliament, to switch parties, you have to walk across the floor quite noticeably. By contrast, in the semicircle that you find, for instance, in French Parliament, you can gradually move to the left without anybody noticing. I would like to thank Adam and the Boyden Gray Center for co-sponsoring this event. It's been a great pleasure collaborating with them. This couldn't be a better site. Adam mentioned that we're in the Decatur House. This building, or the one across the courtyard, was designed by Benjamin Latrobe, the same architect of the U.S. Capitol building. As Adam said, I am president of the National Civic Art Society. Founded in 2002, the National Civic Art Society is a nonprofit organization that educates and empowers our leaders in the promotion of public art and architecture worthy of our great republic. We do so by advancing the classical tradition in civic design. We believe that that tradition is unparalleled in its beauty, harmony, and dignity, not to mention its legibility to the common man. It is no accident that the Founding Fathers chose the classical style when designing the nation's capital and core buildings of government. The founders sought to harken back to Republican Rome and democratic Athens, and they knew that classical architecture was time-honored and timeless. The National Civic Art Society works to continue and expand upon the founders' vision for the nation's capital and for federal design generally. Although some of our work has been focused on the design of monuments and memorials, one of our chief goals is to reform how the General Services Administration chooses architects for its projects. GSA is the agency responsible for the design and construction of all federal buildings and courthouses, both in Washington, D.C. and around the country. GSA's annual budget is $21 billion, and 1/2% of all construction funds goes towards art to be placed in or around its buildings. Given the number and size of GSA's buildings, together with the amount of art it commissions, GSA is the largest patron of art and architecture in the country. As you will hear tonight, GSA has for decades had a modernist agenda, one that opposes anything classical or traditional in design. The sad fact is that our leaders in government have not been paying attention to what has been going on, and GSA's architectural decision makers have taken advantage of this. Well, the National Civic Art Society is paying attention, and we hope that as a result of the talk this evening, you will too. Tonight's speaker, Catesby Leigh, has been writing about public art and architecture for 20 years. Particular areas of interest have been monuments, institutional buildings, urban planning, and painting and sculpture. His commentary has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, National Review, the Weekly Standard, City Journal, First Things, and the Claremont Review of Books, among many other places. Catesby is a co-founder and past chair of the National Civic Art Society, and he's currently the Society's research fellow. A resident of Washington, D.C., Catesby is working on a long-term book project concerning the nature of monumentality and its American manifestations. Please join me in welcoming Catesby Leigh.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Adam, for hosting this event. And as a co-founder of the NCAS, I can say it's a great pleasure to see Justin being nominated for the Commission of Fine Arts, because there's a real need to establish an infrastructure supporting cultural alternatives to the status quo I'm going to describe in this talk. So, without further ado, in my edition of Webster's, the word bureaucracy comes in for pretty rough treatment. Definition 1, the administration of government through departments and subdivisions managed by sets of appointed officials following an inflexible routine. Definition 2, the officials collectively. And 3, governmental officialism or inflexible routine. See also red tape. Bureaucrat gets just one definition. An official in a bureaucracy, especially one who follows a routine in a mechanical, unimaginative way, insisting on proper forms, petty rules, etc. Now, if you subscribe to Churchill's famous pronouncement that we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us, the mechanical and unimaginative character of a building like this one, the Department of Energy's James V. Forrestal building on Independence Avenue, or the Francis Perkins Labor Department building near the foot of Capitol Hill, might be taken for ideal incubators of mechanical and unimaginative functionaries. My own outlook is not so deterministic. I would say these buildings simply look like the kinds of structures that are apt to be inhabited by mechanical and unimaginative functionaries. More ominously, it is not hard to imagine the East German secret police feeling right at home in a brutalist pile like the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover building on Pennsylvania Avenue, whose upper floors had to be fitted out with a kind of hairnet a decade or so ago because the behemoth had developed a potentially lethal case of concrete dandruff. Nor would it be far-fetched to imagine a sinister bureaucracy infesting this remarkably dystopian federal office building erected a decade ago in San Francisco. We are quite unlikely, on the other hand, to place totalitarian enforcers in a high-rise of earlier vintage like the Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse on Manhattan's Foley Square, which was erected during the Depression, or in this recently constructed U.S. courthouse in Montgomery, Alabama. For well over half a century, the design of federal buildings has supposedly conformed to the guiding principles of federal architecture drafted by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. It's fair to say Moynihan, a Kennedy administration aide who went on to become a distinguished U.S. Senator from New York, was interested in creating the antithesis of an architecture of bureaucracy. In his words, he wished federal buildings to provide visual testimony to the dignity, enterprise, vigor, and stability of the American national government. We might say he was calling for an architecture suited to civil servants or public officials rather than bureaucrats. It's hardly inconceivable that Moynihan was thinking of our nation's classical civic architecture, epitomized by the United States Capitol when he used the words dignity, enterprise, vigor, and stability. Yet the guiding principles made the architectural evocation of these governmental attributes an unlikely outcome. They did so by warning against, quote, development of an official style, unquote, and by insisting that, quote, design must flow from the architectural profession to the government and not vice versa, unquote. In the same vein, the guidelines state that, quote, major emphasis should be placed on the choice of designs that embody the finest contemporary American thought, unquote. There are several problems with these directives. First, the government is the patron, but I would argue that Moynihan's guidelines have tended to convert it and the taxpayer into victims. In far too many cases, they have encouraged indifference to classical architecture's establishment after the founding of an appropriate aesthetic and symbolic presence for the federal government in our nation's public squares. They have served to afflict our federal architecture with the aesthetic and symbolic poverty and acute stylistic instability afflicting modernist architecture. When it comes to the finest contemporary American architectural thought, a pivotal issue immediately arises. Who defines the terms? Modernist architects, academics, and critics within the cultural elite and their fellow travelers in the federal bureaucracy? Oops. Or architects, artists, and informed laymen who subscribe to the classical principles that have done so much to shape the government's image in the public mind. Moynihan's guidelines do not have the force of law, but they are cited as holy writ by the General Services Administration, commonly known as the GSA, which is responsible for erecting federal office buildings and courthouses across the country. But as we will see, it has failed to live up to them in a great many cases. Certainly, few of us would associate dignity, enterprise, vigor, and stability with the Forrestal or Perkins buildings or the San Francisco Federal Office Building, all of which were built after the guiding principles formulation. Whether or not classical architecture was ever declared the official style of the federal government, it had the unambiguous sanction of the two most culturally sophisticated founders, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and it constituted the government's predominant architectural idiom throughout the history of the Republic down to the Second World War. For most of this period, the artistic sensibility of America's cultural elites and the public at large tended to coincide. Everybody gets the U.S. Capitol, just like everybody gets the Statue of Liberty and the Lincoln Memorial. Such an alignment between the political and cultural powers that be and the public is a defining trait of civilization. It is what allows a society to symbolize itself, its history, and its ideals in terms everyone can understand. This is a very old story. Only the more educated and artistically knowledgeable Athenian citizens were likely to comprehend the degree of refinement achieved in the Parthenon's architecture and sculptural decoration, but its magnificence was readily legible to the entire populace. The U.S. Capitol is our Parthenon, American civic art's supreme achievement, a building that is universally loved, a building whose image is known the world over. Not surprisingly, it was emulated over many years in the designs of magnificent state houses across the country. Consensus between elite cultural actors and the public often crumbles, however, when it comes to modernist architecture. Take a high-profile federal building from the late 60s that has been praised for reflecting Moynihan's principles, the Robert C. Weaver Housing and Urban Development Building in Southwest Washington. When the building opened in 1968, the architecture critic of the New York Times pronounced it a handsome, functional structure that adds quality design and genuine 20th century style to a city badly in need of both. A quarter century later, two scholars declared in their architectural history of the nation's capital that the Weaver Building's architect, Marcel Breuer, epitomized modernity, whatever that's supposed to mean, while the Weaver Building fit perfectly the guiding principles call for designs embodying the finest contemporary American architectural thought. In a 2003 survey of its earlier modernist projects, GSA praised the building for, quote, taking the lead in construction in the District of Columbia's Southwest Washington development area, unquote, thereby symbolically demonstrating, quote, the federal government's commitment to urban renewal across the nation. People in less exalted cultural strata tend to take a more dyspeptic view. George H.W. Bush's HUD Secretary, Jack Kemp, described the Weaver Building as 10 floors of basement. Sean Donovan, who served in the same post under President Obama, noted that, quote, the building itself is among the most reviled in all of Washington, and with good reason, unquote. As for the finest contemporary American architectural thought, the architectural thought underlying the Weaver Building isn't American at all. A cardinal feature is the concrete stilts, or pilotis, on which it is perched, a motif pioneered by Le Corbusier, the Swiss-born French designer who remains the most influential of all modernist architects over half a century after his death. Nor is there anything particularly American about the monotonous repetition of concave window modules on the Weaver Building. For the record, the Hungarian-born Breuer was the protege of modernist pioneer Walter Gropius at that famous German incubator of modernism, the Bauhaus. Gropius brought him to Harvard's Graduate School of Design when he was appointed the school's chairman in 1937. For his HUD project, Breuer reworked a scheme previously employed at his UNESCO headquarters in Paris, which you're seeing here, as well as an IBM research center in southeastern France. The diagrammatic configuration of the Weaver Building shares with Breuer's French constructions, reflects Le Corbusier's urban vision, which lay at the heart of America's urban renewal disasters of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The Corbusian mentality, so deeply hostile not only to the historic architectural forms, but also to the pedestrian-oriented scale, that is to say, the human scale, of the historic city, has proven thoroughly antithetical to the creation of a sense of place. That mentality is geared to large, self-referential structures like the Weaver Building that are inhuman in scale and conceived as isolated objects in space. It is radically incompatible with Peter Charles L'Enfant's Great Washington Plan of 1791. It is also totally at odds with the guiding principles call for special attention to be paid to, quote, the general ensemble of streets and public places of which federal buildings will form a part, unquote. The proof lies in the 7 vinyl-clad flying saucer-like forms that provide some shade while serving as lighting fixtures. They were installed during the 1990s along with circular concrete planters in a forlorn effort to relieve the desolation of Breuer's Plaza. As for the Southwest Washington Urban Renewal Campaign, of which the Weaver Building forms a conspicuous part, you can see the dismal results in this 1990 photograph, with the Weaver Building on the right and L'Enfant Plaza on the left, with the Forrestal Building at L'Enfant Plaza's foot. Let me quote the standard history of urban planning in Washington. The campaign, quote, involved the clearing of 400 acres and the forced removal of 23,500 people, of whom 76% were Black residents. The redevelopment process exacted a huge human toll, mainly on the large number of people displaced because no replacement housing was provided. Many blocks of potentially historic buildings were leveled. But none of the issues I've raised, nor the fact that the Weaver Building looks like the perfect redoubt for benighted bureaucrats charged with unimaginatively and maybe even mechanically administering totally misconceived urban renewal schemes across the land, prevented Breuer's concrete contraption from being declared, quote, one of the most successful buildings in GSA's modern building inventory, unquote, in its 2003 survey, or kept it from being added to the National Register of Historic Places. That happened a decade ago. Some people, including the modernist apparat in charge of the National Register, never learn. Maybe that apparat should be ordered to compile a National Register of Infamous Places. By the way, another Breuer creation nearby, the Hubert H. Humphrey Department of Health and Human Services building, deserves to join the Weaver Building in that register of architectural infamies. Stasi operatives would surely feel right at home there, too. Let us turn to a brief overview of the classical tradition's role in shaping America's federal buildings. Civic buildings that fall within the English classical tradition appear fairly early in our colonial history, as with the old State House in Boston and the first Capitol in Williamsburg, which was reconstructed in the 1930s. These buildings were erected at what we might call an enlarged domestic scale. Before the close of the 18th century, Charles Bulfinch's new State House in Boston and Thomas Jefferson's Capitol in Richmond, which you're seeing in an old stereograph, achieved a monumental scale through the use their designers made of the classical orders, meaning columns and the superstructures or entablatures they support. The Virginia Capitol was modeled on an ancient Roman temple in the French city of Nîmes, which Jefferson discovered in Palladio's great Renaissance treatise, The Four Books on Architecture, and visited while serving as the American minister to France during the 1780s. L'Enfant, the French-born genius who created the Plan of Washington, converted New York City Hall into Federal Hall in time for Washington's inauguration in 1789. A magnificent new New York City Hall was completed in 1811. Decades later, a classical customs house appeared at the site of the demolished Federal Hall. Both front and rear porticos were modeled on the Parthenon. Later, a treasury building and now a museum, the building was enriched in 1883 with the superb statue of Washington. The larger Customs House, erected at Bowling Green at the turn of the last century, is one of the nation's greatest public buildings, decorated with monumental figure groups by Daniel Chester French, sculptor of the Lincoln statue on the National Mall. The United States Capitol's creation involved a number of gifted architects over a period exceeding 75 years. The first iteration, which you see here, was completed during the 1820s. Extensions of the House and Senate wings were built during the 1850s, and the new dome was completed in 1865. At Lincoln's insistence, as he was entirely aware of the project's national symbolic significance. Thomas U. Walter of Philadelphia achieved complete perfection of proportions in his design of the new Capitol dome, both in the dome itself and in its relationship to the very broad Capitol building as a whole. Constantino Brumidi's Apotheosis of Washington, which crowns the rotunda within, is one of the truly prodigious feats in the annals of American art. Brumidi's apotheosis extends over 4,664 square feet and was executed in the challenging medium of fresco, in which paint must be rapidly applied to wet plaster. Architectural histories of the United States, however, are unlikely to give the Capitol dome and rotunda their due, and for two reasons. One relates to misguided art historical notions of progress, which we'll discuss later on. Another bears on Walter's dome in particular and concerns the use of materials. On that score, the dome violates one of the principal commandments of Romantic and Modernist architectural dogma, the one requiring factual expression of construction. The Capitol dome is not built of masonry, as it appears to be. It is built of iron, and its exterior surface is painted iron. The eminent Victorian critic John Ruskin excoriated such artifice, which happens to have a very long tradition in Western architecture, as an offense against truth. And modernist theorists would take up the theme. George Washington, however, was in Thomas U. Walter's camp, meaning he was attuned to perceptual effect rather than material obsessions. He had Mount Vernon's wooden cladding carved and painted to make it look like rusticated stone. The construction and expansion of the Capitol during the 19th century occurred against the backdrop of a romantic succession of architectural styles, but the classical idiom retained its predominance in federal and other government architecture. The Greek revival of the early 19th century was, of course, a classical development. It gave us the original New York Customs Building with its Parthenon-inspired portico, along with Robert Mills' old Patent Office building, which is now home to the Smithsonian's Museum of American Art and National Portrait Gallery, and Mills's Treasury Department, with its truly majestic 466-foot-long Ionic colonnade facing 15th Street. A Gothic revival phase followed on the heels of the Greek, only partially influenced by Ruskin's passion for the medieval architecture of Venice. This episode was characterized by eclecticism, as with the Connecticut State Capitol, erected during the 1870s. This Capitol combines French and Victorian Gothic elements. The decades following the Civil War are in fact notorious, not just for eclecticism, but for stylistic mayhem, evoked for many by mere mention of the words Victorian architecture. In Washington, the upshot was that the old State War and Navy building erected just west of the White House took its cues not from Greece, Rome, Jefferson's beloved Palladio, or the France of Louis, but from the Second Empire style that emerged during the reign of Napoleon III. The building surely contributed to the style's brief duration on our shores. Gothic buildings of the period, such as this long since demolished Divinity School building and chapel at Yale, tended to strive a little too hard for picturesque effect. The tendency was taken to further extremes in countless residences like this decidedly Victorian confection in the California town of Eureka. A limited number of outstanding buildings were erected during this confused period, and perhaps the greatest of all where civic architecture is concerned is Henry Hobson Richardson's Allegheny County Courthouse and Jail in Pittsburgh, completed 2 years after Richardson's premature death in 1886. Richardson, who studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris during the Civil War, was inspired by Ruskin and the Romanesque architecture of France's Auvergne region. the Romanesque being an early medieval style that preceded the development of the Gothic. But this primitive idiom, unlike the classical, has a narrow expressive range. It is by definition very massive. Few architects handled it well, and the style faded from the scene not long after Richardson's death. The confusion came to an end near the close of the 19th century with the most important architectural event in American history, the world's Columbian Exposition staged in Chicago on Lake Michigan's western shore in 1893. This being a fair, the architecture was temporary, clad in plaster bonded with shredded hemp. The centerpiece of the exposition was the Court of Honor and its grand basin. The court was terminated at its east end by a peristyle or colonnade in front of which stood Daniel Chester French's statue of the Republic. At the opposite end stood the administration building. The court was flanked by large, richly decorated monumental structures housing exhibits devoted to agriculture, machinery, manufactures, mines, and electricity. Plazas and esplanades were replete with sculpture, fountains, flagpoles, and balustrades. The court's scenographic effect was overwhelming, and this explains more than anything why the fair attracted such a tremendous number of visitors, more than 27 million over 6 months. Hamlin Garland, a noted writer who grew up in rural Wisconsin, wasn't only speaking for the denizens of the heartland when he described the fair's impact on his family. The wonder and the beauty of it all moved these dwellers of the level lands to tears of joy, which was almost as poignant as pain. Stunned by the majesty of the vision, my mother sat in her chair, visioning it all, yet comprehending little of its meaning. Her life had been spent among homely small things, and these gorgeous scenes dazzled her, overwhelmed her, letting in upon her in one mighty flood 1,000 stupefying suggestions of the art and history and poetry of the world. The fair's impact was such that serious thought was given to making the Court of Honor and its buildings permanent. An exceptionally handsome classical structure devoted to the fine arts and located elsewhere on the grounds was in fact rebuilt in permanent form and now houses Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry. But the influential New York architecture critic Montgomery Schuyler was hostile to such notions, and not for reasons of practicality. Men bring not back the mastodon, he proclaimed in an essay published months after the fair's close. He was referring directly to the exposition's physical resurrection, but the comment was, of course, a double entendre. For Schuyler, the classical grandeur of Athens, Rome, Paris, London, and yes, Washington, of whose architectural impact on the public he was well aware, was obsolete as a model for contemporary practice. Architecture, no less than scientific knowledge, technology, or organic nature itself, must evolve. It was past time to give authentic expression to the new building technologies, especially steel construction technology, that the industrial age had ushered in, and not disguise them as Walter had done with his Capitol dome. Schuyler portrayed the fair in terms of, quote, the entertainment of a holiday crowd, unquote, the architect's achievement as, quote, the stage setting for an unexampled spectacle, unquote, and, quote, a fairy city, unquote, utterly divorced from and antithetical to true architecture, which he defined in starkly materialistic terms as, quote, the correlation of structure and function. If architecture is to be real and living and progressive, Schuyler added, its forms must be the results of material and construction. To give the critic his due, it's hard to imagine architecture not being the result of material and construction. But there's no question we see wholly mistaken modernist dogma adumbrated in his commentary on the Chicago Fair. Schuyler's assessment of the Exposition's architectural ramifications was hamstrung by a pseudo-scientific materialism. The misapplication of scientific dogma to the arts of form is one of the titanic blunders of the modern age. Among other things, this fallacy leads inexorably to architecture's conversion from technology's master into technology's slave. We are fortunate that Henry Adams recorded his thoughts on the Exposition in his famous autobiography, The Education of Henry Adams. Adams may have worshipped the Gothic of Chartres Cathedral and resided in a rather gloomy Washington mansion designed by the aforementioned Henry Hobson Richardson, but he was profoundly moved by what he called the Court of Honor's inconceivable scenic display. Sitting on the steps of the administration building, Adams pondered the fact that the Chicago Fair, though dedicated largely to the exhibition of the nation's dizzying technological progress, involving everything from ocean steamers to explosives, had taken an altogether different tack with regard to architecture. Here, he wrote, was a breach of continuity, a rupture in historical sequence. Was it real or only apparent? Dismissing deterministic and misleading schemes of historical progress, such as Schuyler's, Adams dared to hope that, quote, the new American world would take this sharp and conscious turn towards ideals, unquote. His conclusion, Chicago was the first expression of American thought as a unity. One must start there. Adams reached that bold conclusion because the Exposition embodied the aspiration that America's material progress should not be an end in itself, but rather serve the purpose, the higher purpose of creating a great American civilization. Needless to say, it was precisely this aspiration that underlay the classical visions of Washington and Jefferson and the architects they employed, starting with L'Enfant. Eminent designers like Charles Follen McKim, the architect who most decisively influenced the Court of Honor's design, were acutely aware of the fact that they were reinstating and building on an American tradition of monumental civic art that originated with the founders. Within a decade of the Chicago Fair, McKim accordingly played a key role in shaping a U.S. Senate Commission's plan for the extension of L'Enfant's Mall in Washington, which created space on the Potomac's reclaimed tidal flats for the Lincoln Memorial, which would be designed by McKim's protege, Henry Bacon. Another McKim protege, William Mitchell Kendall, designed a supremely monumental and, of course, steel-framed high-rise in Lower Manhattan, the Municipal Building, definitely an edifice intended to house civil servants rather than bureaucrats, and definitely a building embodying the idea of government as a pillar of civilization. The Municipal Building's mighty columnar screen serves as a stupendous gateway on Chambers Street. Before his death in 1909, McKim himself designed the majestic Pennsylvania Station in New York City, whose reconstruction is being advocated by the National Civic Art Society, half a century after its supremely unfortunate demolition. A great hall in the baths of Caracalla in Rome was brilliantly adapted to the design of the station's general waiting room. The Chicago Exposition marked a major development for the architectural profession as well. Heretofore, American architects had generally received their training by apprenticing themselves to established professionals. Along with Richardson, McKim, and the Architect of the Fairs Administration Building, Richard Morris Hunt, along with Richardson, McKim, and the Architect of the Fairs Administration Building, Richard Morris Hunt, the three, I should say, were in the vanguard of American architects who received academic training at the École des Beaux-Arts. The École exercised profound influence on American architectural instruction, which began to be offered by American universities including MIT, Columbia, and Penn. The result was a higher standard for American architecture in general, starting with federal buildings such as the Bowling Green Customs House we saw earlier on, and this at a time when progressive politics was expanding government's role in American society. The qualitative impact wasn't limited to classical architecture. Campus architecture, much of it in the collegiate Gothic idiom inherited from Oxford and Cambridge, improved dramatically. The same holds for church architecture, especially Gothic church architecture, as well as high-rise commercial buildings, which later on were designed in modern styles derived from the classical or Gothic, and residential design in various modes and for different income groups. In short, the United States produced more and more high-quality architecture as it prospered in the decades following the Chicago Fair. This dispensation endured until the Great Depression. One of the last great expressions of the urban vision erected in Chicago is the vast 75-acre Federal Triangle complex in Washington, erected immediately north of the mall. You're seeing it minus the Apex building at its east end in the center of this photograph. The Federal Triangle is the brainchild of Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, who served under Presidents Coolidge, Harding, and Hoover, and who also paid for construction of the National Gallery of Art's West Building while donating a considerable portion of its core collection. Here we see the Commerce Department situated at the Triangle's western end, the Interdepartmental Building with its Mellon Auditorium, and the National Archives. Once again, it seems fair to say the Federal Triangle buildings, largely constructed during the Depression, were designed for civil servants, not bureaucrats. During the 1930s, classically oriented design tended to become less ornate, more stripped, as with the Federal Reserve headquarters completed in 1938, and more streamlined, as with this Art Deco U.S. courthouse and post office in Philadelphia. Decorative styles became more modern and expressionistic too, as with this bombastic relief adorning the Philadelphia building's exterior, and social realist mural paintings in federal buildings in Washington and elsewhere. After the Second World War, the already frayed classical thread was sundered altogether. The idea of embodying the dignity, enterprise, vigor, and stability of government institutions in the nation's communities through the Western world's cardinal architectural idiom was dismissed as obsolete. The conviction in certain quarters that we shouldn't build federal buildings like we used to was reinforced by the more widespread assumption that we couldn't build them like we used to because it was too expensive. The break with tradition was marked in administrative terms by the transfer of authority over most of the federal government's architectural endeavors from the Treasury Department to the GSA, which was created in 1949. For a time, GSA attempted to address Uncle Sam's burgeoning requirements largely through lease purchase arrangements for commercial office space, but this approach proved inadequate. The guiding principles were part of a Kennedy administration mandate to rectify the situation. Around the time the principles were formulated in 1962 and for years thereafter, however, much federal architecture in fact resembled uninspired commercial real estate development. That would apply to the Javits Federal Office Building across Foley Square from federal and state courthouses of far more august lineage. This 1970s federal building in downtown San Diego looks like it belongs in a suburban office park. In Denver, what is now the Byron White U.S. Courthouse remains a much-loved local landmark. It was succeeded by a thoroughly undistinguished federal office building slab and U.S. courthouse that, but for the canopy and skimpy detached porch in front, might pass for a power plant. In San Francisco, the over-the-top rustication of this much-loved U.S. Court of Appeals building from the turn of the last century and the more refined elegance of this later federal office building were succeeded by the visual desolation of this federal building and courthouse. Of course, space demands had vastly increased during the interval, but the low-rise classical buildings we've just seen suggest the alternative of a monumental architectural base at street level surmounted by a recessed high-rise structure of complementary design. Whether or not that was considered an option 50 years ago, it is an option. Make that an imperative now. In Boston, the John F. Kennedy Federal Building was designed by Walter Gropius as part of the Government Center Urban Renewal Project, a disaster comparable to the Southwest Washington redevelopment campaign. Again, we confront the monotony of so typical of the architecture of the period, along with the absence of a humanistic physiognomy identifying the building with the United States government. For the record, it was Gropius's stated principle that the new architecture must reflect what he called the new world order of the machine. Robert Motherwell's abstract expressionist painting in the lobby answers the guiding principle's call for the incorporation of fine art into new federal buildings, but also reflects modernism's rejection of the human body as the basis of design. What's more, the organic bond between the figurative decoration of classical buildings and the anthropomorphic character of the classical canon is typically absent in modernist architecture. Entitled New England Elegy, for some reason or other, Motherwell's painting thus inevitably caters to private sensibilities. After all, when you turn your back on natural forms and on the human form above all, you're apt to turn your back on symbolism the public can understand. The reputation of Mies van der Rohe shines more brightly than Gropius's, and GSA regards his federal center in Chicago, including a 1.2 million square foot office high-rise, a U.S. courthouse slab, and a low-rise post office as a crown jewel. The plaza boasts Alexander Calder's 53-foot-high steel sculpture entitled Flamingo. In this photo, you can see the play of its reflection in the post office's glass curtain wall, the play of reflections being an architectural effect Mies valued highly. By all accounts, Flamingo is a popular landmark, but is it a civic landmark? The Federal Center's combination of totally abstract and unornamented architecture with an eye-catching expressionistic sculpture is a familiar modernist formula, as with the Chase Manhattan Plaza in Lower Manhattan. But it is a formula better suited to the high-end corporate world and its promotion of itself as culturally au courant than the federal government. Over the years, GSA has commissioned a lot of questionable art through its art and architecture program. The most publicized disaster was Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, installed in 1981 in the plaza outside the Javits Building at Foley Square. It was so widely reviled, it wound up being disassembled and moved 8 years later. The continuing problem with the program is that GSA routinely commissions artists to explore their own more or less idiosyncratic notions of what art is, rather than engaging the public through representational art that communicates the nation's history and ideals. One might wonder what this sculptural mess, which its creator elected to call stare decisis, in reference to the juridical principle of abiding by precedent, is doing at a U.S. courthouse. The same question arises with this wall painting in another federal courthouse. It is perhaps more forthrightly entitled Loopy Doopy. But the most offensive GSA-commissioned artwork I'm aware of dates to 1991 and is situated in a plaza outside the banal, corporate modernist-style Edward R. Roybal Federal Building and U.S. Courthouse in Los Angeles. The work consists of a postmodern caricature of a classical pergola with a sculptural frieze whose Pillsbury Doughboy-like figures enact the destruction of patriarchy, along with its architectural accessories, and indeed, patriarchy's dismemberment. The centerpiece is a fountain featuring an infant with emphatically rendered female genitalia who is holding up a globe. What we have here is a shock the bourgeois routine with an obvious subtext about who owns the future. The congressman for whom the building was named requested that this infant and another female figure be removed, remarking that they belonged in a museum, not a government building. His wish was only temporarily honored. And the artist, who had previously attracted attention by shooting a dog for a video, went on to receive several other GSA commissions. Returning to architecture, the GSA made a more sustained effort to commission high-quality architecture after the introduction of its Design Excellence program in the mid-1990s. It has devoted much effort to publicizing the results of this program, including handsomely produced monographs on projects it regards as particularly noteworthy. The results of the program are a very mixed bag. We can certainly give GSA credit for steering clear of an official style. But its heart is quite obviously with cutting-edge design, and it has commissioned not only the aforementioned San Francisco Federal Building, but also a U.S. courthouse in Eugene, Oregon, from Tom Main, whose self-referential, self-indulgent, hyper-expressionistic approach to architectural design should have disqualified him from such projects. By the way, the stare decisis sculpture adorns Maine's Eugene courthouse. On the other hand, GSA has commissioned the classical courthouse in Montgomery we saw early on, as well as this new courthouse in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The latter is certainly a huge improvement on its predecessor, which GSA built in the late 1960s. The new Tuscaloosa Courthouse's decoration includes paintings on historical subjects that are apt to be meaningful to the public. In between these extremes, there is the occasional building that, while not relying on a classical vocabulary, betrays a sense of civic decorum, such as the high-rise Theodore Roosevelt U.S. Courthouse in Brooklyn, completed in 2006. But buildings like the Roosevelt Courthouse don't generate buzz, and buzz is something GSA is eager to generate. Maine's federal building in San Francisco, located just a block away from that beautiful U.S. Court of Appeals building, generated a great deal of buzz. It seems to be the only building to which GSA devoted a monograph even before it was built. After its completion, yet another bedazzled New York Times critic exulted, "It may one day be remembered as the crowning achievement of GSA's Design Excellence Program." A decade later, the buzz is long gone. The building consists of a curiously shallow, window-walled concrete slab separated by several feet on its eastern elevation from a weird metal mesh wrapping. The extravagantly bizarre construction system was justified on energy conservation grounds. The public space Maine designed in front of the building was supposed to improve street life in a troubled neighborhood, but is proven, in the words of the San Francisco Chronicle, to be a virtual moat with little activity except the swirl of wind-blown trash. The slab's glassy rear elevation is utterly devoid of human scale. For the second GSA monograph on his San Francisco building, which offers an upper-level light show by conceptual artist James Turrell, Maine contributed these prefatory remarks. When architecture engages social, cultural, political, and ethical currents, it has the power to transform the way we see the world and our place in it. It is from this intersection of broad societal themes that we approached the design for the new federal building in San Francisco. Clearly, Maine subscribes to Churchill's dictum, "We shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us." His utterly dehumanized creation shows how that idea can be manipulated to justify a morbidly iconoclastic architecture whose supposed ethical justification lies in the realm of social engineering. Can we really believe GSA was concerned with providing visual testimony to the dignity, vigor, enterprise, and stability of the American national government when it commissioned this building? The same question arises with this new U.S. courthouse in Salt Lake City. The architect has defended his approach to the design in these terms: "We believe that rather than use the classical elements that Jefferson brought to America from Europe, people should experience a contemporary justice that is open, transparent, and light-filled." Openness, and especially transparency, are in fact the most frequent qualitative watchwords for contemporary federal architecture, while sustainability is the environmental imperative. But the most sustainable buildings aren't those that boast up-to-date resource conservation features such as displacement ventilation, evaporative cooling, and toilets that gulp rather than flush. The most sustainable buildings are the ones that will stand not for an investment cycle or a fashion cycle, but for centuries, because they are built to last, and above all, because they are loved. On the latter score, the Salt Lake Courthouse may have a problem. The locals have dubbed it the Borg Cube, after the evil aliens in Star Trek and their cubic spaceships. As for the Salt Lake Courthouse architect's facile dismissal of the European origins of Jefferson's architecture, it overlooks the fact that the origins of his own modernist architectural idiom, including his exquisitely minimalist lobby, are themselves European, grounded in a long series of reductionist theories dating back to the French Enlightenment. Transparency, for its part, simply serves as justification for extremely glassy buildings modernist architects like to build, but that don't necessarily make sense in practical, let alone symbolic terms. The celebrated architect Richard Meyer erected such a structure where common sense would suggest it least belongs in the blazing hot climate of Phoenix, Arizona. Of course, new technologies can sometimes provide workarounds for such exotic ideas, but not always. Temperatures in the atrium of Meyer's Sandra Day O'Connor U.S. Courthouse have been known to reach 100 degrees. As for Meyer's better-known U.S. courthouse on Long Island, it is certainly an eye-catching structure, but might as well be the headquarters of a pharmaceutical company. One can only conclude that GSA and the modernist architectural establishment of which it forms part have failed to reliably provide our country with federal buildings and courthouses embodying the dignity, vigor, enterprise, and stability of the American national government. Instead, federal architecture has been subjected to the same stylistic instability that has plagued modernist architecture for the simple reason that its adepts have never come anywhere near generating an enduring formal vocabulary to rival the classical canon. There also seems to be an ideological syndrome in play, which involves the notion that progressive architecture is a pillar of the whole progressive political project. Politics becomes the modernist scoundrel's last refuge as he denounces classical architecture as reactionary, if not fascist. The classical is not a political idiom in an ideological sense. The classical canon, based on the different orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, is more akin to a three-dimensional language, with a syntax indicating how its elements fit together, but not to the degree that the skilled designer is deprived of creative freedom. True creative freedom, however, can only result from formal discipline. Without that, we're stuck with loopy-doopy and misbegotten piles like the San Francisco Federal Building. To be sure, the language of the classical canon can be used well or badly in terms of the quality of the building incorporating it, and even in terms of the purposes or the regime that building serves. In this country, the language has been used quite well, by and large, and in both senses, because it speaks to an ideal sense of life that informs and enriches our brief earthly sojourns. The canon's origins lie in the archaic Greeks' forsaking of wood and mud brick temples for temples of stone. In this process, still the subject of speculation and debate, their architectural vocabulary was transfigured with vestiges of the old construction retained in the new. But the objective was to emphasize the temple's sanctity, literally, its apartness. That's why the Parthenon crowns that great rocky promontory. For the same reason, L'Enfant likened the eminence that would later be known as Capitol Hill to a pedestal waiting for a monument. The government building should itself stand apart from commonplace architecture in our cities and towns. It should be built for the long haul in a formal idiom that idealizes the act of building in a manner befitting government's constructive endeavors, an idiom that has served mankind well for many, many centuries. Clearly, that is what the founders intended, and that was our tradition until not so long ago. Just because commercial real estate developers have discovered that office workers think floor-to-ceiling glass is really cool doesn't provide the slightest justification for the design of federal buildings in that mode. The mania for floor-to-ceiling glass will fade. And in fact, the glass facades themselves will be gone in 20 or 25 years and replaced with the next really cool thing. Our government architecture should reflect a higher, more enduring standard. But can we build them like we used to? The Rayburn House office building, completed in 1965, was taken for evidence we couldn't. It's not a great building, and it's not hard to reach that conclusion because there are so many excellent classical buildings in its vicinity. But it should be borne in mind that when tradition is cast aside, buildings vastly worse than the Rayburn are sure to get constructed and in great quantity. It's also worth noting that the Rayburn project was directed by an architect of the Capitol who wasn't even an architect. The designer, from a distinguished Philadelphia firm, was consigned to the margins, and it shows. Nowadays, however, we are seeing more and more new institutional buildings that indicate we can indeed build high-quality traditional architecture. Here's a beautiful courtyard at a residential college at Princeton erected a decade ago. The quality of the stonework you're seeing here was supposed to have gone the way of the mastodon. Construction of 2 spectacular new residential colleges at Yale involved a recently developed system of off-site panelized wall fabrication. For decades now, economies have been achieved through computer-controlled machinery used to fabricate traditional architectural details, with handwork reserved for final touches. Of his Yale colleges, the architect Robert Stern has remarked, "In my view, the reason people say you can't do something like that anymore is that they don't want to do something like that anymore." Here's an exterior view of the new Roman Catholic Cathedral in Knoxville. Here's the interior. And here's the old cathedral. I think any normal person, maybe even Montgomery Schuyler, would see very clear evidence of architectural progress here. The point is that the 2 Alabama courthouses we've seen are part of a broader cultural trend, while they themselves mark a point of departure for, rather than the culmination of, an indispensable classical reorientation of our government architecture. Such a reorientation needs to be a primary goal of all those who aspire to a renewal of American civilization. The objective is simple, as it was for the architects of the Chicago Fair, to reinstate the founders' guiding principles for a federal architecture embodying the dignity, vigor, enterprise, and stability of the American national government, while reaffirming Henry Adams' timeless vision of American thought as a unity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Al.
That was really wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sorry, that's going to be the end of the program, but I do want to say, first of all, thank you very, very much to Catesby, Leigh, and Justin Shubo and the National Civic Art Society for this wonderful, wonderful story of how better to understand what happens on the outside, or what we see on the outside of these buildings. It's the work of the C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State to help to better understand what happens inside of those buildings, and I'm very proud to continue its work. I do want to say very briefly, because of the location of tonight's talk, I want to thank, speaking of beautiful buildings, I want to thank the White House Historical Association for opening this space to us. I should add that it's not too soon or too late to buy your 2018 White House Christmas ornament. This year they're honoring President Truman with the south view of the White House. The gift shop is closed, but I'm told it's open tomorrow at 9 a.m. But with that, I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to thank one more time our speaker, and good night. Thank you.